Good morning, everybody. I wanted to provide you all an update to the winter forecast, particularly for the West region, which has gone through a quieter stretch predictably across the summer, but there are new signals. We have to talk about La Niña coming up here over the next few months and what that might mean for drought, the precipitation patterns across California, Oregon, other areas in the West, including the Snake River Valley, Arizona, and all the way up perhaps into Utah and Nevada. At least looking down right now at the jet stream across the North Pacific, you can see North America here on the top right of this image. The word, I want to use is discombobulated. It's kind of doubling back on itself, switching back, if you will. And that's pretty, the blocked up pattern, as we would call as meteorologists. And just what we mean by that is you don't see a lot of west to east flow extended here through North America, at least coming onshore from the Pacific, moving over North America. You can see the jet stream flowing up here into Canada, doubling back on itself. We have this cutoff low here northwest of Hawaii. There's just a lot of variability here in the jet stream, at least in the eastern or the northeast Pacific here. And at least, what I just said there, that last sentence, there's momentum coming out of the northwest Pacific. You can see that relatively west-east or zonal flow, as we call it in meteorology. And that breaks down into this kind of variable nature over the northwest U.S. and the western portions of Canada. That is very La Niña. It's almost, textbook La Niña, that you have this variable polar jet stream coming onshore somewhere in the northwest. Now, typically, if that continues to focus on the northwest, we'll get more precipitation there this winter. Now, we aren't officially in a La Niña. I expect that to be the case at some point here as we go through autumn into early winter. And we typically see this variable nature of the jet stream focusing more so frequently on the Pacific Northwest, bringing them greater rainfall totals and higher snow totals on the northern Cascades and parts of the northern Rockies, at least the northern U.S. Rockies. So at least right now, the picture we're looking at looks fairly La Niña. And if we actually take this into the future, I mentioned that pattern is blocked up, so we'd likely expect that kind of variable nature in the jet stream to continue at least over the next 7 to 10 days. While we're in a drier stretch here through the work week, I think going toward this weekend out west, as I take this forecast forward into Wednesday evening, I can see this kind of clipper system coming through, bringing rainfall to eastern Oregon, parts of central and western Idaho, before on Wednesday evening pushing through the eastern part of the state, east of the Continental Divide. Just a quick system there. Rainfall totals won't be too high. Perhaps some snow totals in the higher elevations in the mountain ranges there. So take this into the weekend. Our next more bona fide system comes on shore Saturday in western Oregon and western Washington. And again, like I said, with that variable jet stream, a lot of chances for these systems to come in, either clipping the northwest or hitting them more wholesale here, as this one does on Saturday, bringing more substantial rainfall totals to Washington, parts of the Willamette Valley, certainly the Cascades and the coastal ranges, before kind of percolating into the eastern portions of the rain shadow here in eastern Oregon, near the Pendleton area on Sunday morning in eastern Washington. See that rain continuing through the weekend into Sunday evening, likely not as strong, still in the Willamette Valley. We can see some of that activity now pushing off into Idaho as we go into Monday morning, and still additional rainfall trying to get into the area Monday evening, even in parts of Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. That takes us out to next week. I don't want to go too much further than that, but we even see another system behind that. So with that variable jet stream, again, that activity, eventually coming onshore in the northwest, I think we're going to have more of these systems to talk about, at least, through the end of October here, before maybe a little bit of a drier signal going into November that we'll talk about in just a second. If I at least take you out and look at the 7-day precipitation totals forecast, you can see nothing too extreme, no flooding concerns or anything with these rainfall events coming in, outside of just some maybe a little concerns here in the Cascades or the coastal ranges. But the Willamette Valley, we're only talking half an inch to about an inch of rainfall. East of the Cascades, lesser so near Pendleton, maybe a quarter of an inch down to a tenth of an inch. Certainly as you go northwest up into the Washington rain shadow, maybe a quarter inch in parts of the Snake River Valley. Now, some of this rainfall that you're seeing in those upper elevations certainly will be falling as snow. So the Cascades getting a little dose of snow totals there, further up into the northern Cascades and Washington even more. And then part of the higher elevations in Idaho as well, receiving a little bit. Not a huge substantial snowmaker here in the middle of October, but this is, again, activity that we see in these La Niña years, more snow focused on the northern U.S. Rockies, parts of the northern Cascades, and leaving California, Nevada, parts of Arizona drier, both in terms of precipitation and snowfall here. So if this pattern kind of continues throughout the winter, we're seeing that flavor of La Niña that we'd expect going through the cold season and the winter months here. Another pattern we typically expect with La Niña, we're seeing even in the 10-day forecast, and you can imagine with these low pressure systems coming through with the with that variable polar jet stream coming down into the northwest. Temperatures will be cooler through the 10-day period as well. This is the GFS temperature anomaly forecast all the way out to the end of October. And you can see cooler than average temperatures for parts of Oregon, starting to get into a little bit of frost concern in the Willamette Valley, certainly east of the Cascades, talking about freezing temperatures as we go through the next 10 days. So this is a story that I think is going to continue, and we'll be looking at a colder winter if some of these forecasts and the La Niña connection comes to fruition here. Jump over and look at the precipitation anomaly. As you might have guessed, again, just looking at the 10-day GFS precipitation departures from normal, seeing more of that focus and activity on the northwest parts of the Willamette Valley, certainly the Cascades, getting a little bit of activity in there into Idaho. Otherwise below normal south of Oregon. You can see California on the drier side there, including parts of Nevada and Arizona. Again, a very La Niña presentation. I just kind of pulled up the textbook, what we expect with La Niña wintertime jet stream and precipitation patterns, and you can see that you get that variable polar jet stream. Again, that's why I said it's almost textbook. You see that blocking high pressure there with that increased focus on precipitation into the northwest. If we jump over and look at the ECMWF extended forecast, that's taking us all the way out through the month of November here for temperature anomalies. Again, anytime we're talking about a 15 to 30 day forecast here, certainly take it with a grain of salt. The model skill or their accuracy at this time range isn't great, but the ECMWF weeklies, the extended forecast here, has been performing a little bit better this year, particularly during the cold season months, so I think it's worth showing and discussing. And what we see here is a kind of continuation of a more seasonal temperature pattern, if not on the cooler side, for much of the western U.S. That includes parts of the interior, Utah, Nevada, parts of Idaho and the Snake River Valley. California certainly not on the warm forecast here, a little bit cooler along the coast and maybe slightly more seasonal as we go inland here. But again, not surprised to see a forecast like this for November. Given that background La Niña conditions, we're seeing cooler waters in the central tropical Pacific, cooler waters developing in the North Pacific, both working to bring a more variable polar jet stream and more of these cold shots as we go through the early winter here. If we jump over and look at that same forecast, that extended forecast out through November for precipitation anomalies rather than temperature, a little bit more on the drier side, particularly for the northwest, including the Sierra Nevadas, the Cascades as well. So despite that kind of uptick in activity that we're expecting over the next 10 days, certainly kind of as we go through the weekend here for the Pacific Northwest, at least one signal here that this might be a little bit less active going into November. I would still think at least December, January into February that activity picks back up, but we could see a lull here before we finally get into winter proper. We do jump out and look at that ECMWF seasonal forecast. This is December, January, February, those precipitation departures. It should look very similar to a graphic I just showed you, and that's that textbook La Niña graphic. We're drier in the southern states out west and wetter in the Pacific Northwest and British Columbia. And we're seeing that same pattern here from the ECMWF, which does have us developing a weak La Niña going into the winter. This is lining up with what we'd expect, even some other signals that we see out into the eastern U.S. as well. Temperature-wise, the ECMWF has a little bit cooler for parts of the Pacific Northwest. That's consistent with what we talked about, but bring more warmth into parts of southeastern California, Nevada, Arizona, Utah. So could be looking at a warmer winter here for some of these interior and southern states. But where that precipitation, where that snowfall is expected across the Northwest, I would expect more seasonal to cooler temperatures. We'll have to see. A little bit skeptical of how much of that heat gets up into the Northwest, but something to keep an eye on. If we just compare that to the Climate Prediction Center and their forecast for this winter, again, December, January, February, the temperature outlook here, they're a little bit more cooler in the Northwest, particularly Idaho, Montana, Washington, Oregon. That is more consistent with what I'd expect given the pattern, what we're seeing even over the next kind of 10 to 15 days of the forecast, with more of the warmth centered over Arizona. And then the precipitation forecast, again, more of that focus on the Pacific Northwest. Not the strongest signal here, and not the strongest drag signal for California. It is expected that this La Niña will be a little bit on the weaker side, and we do see less correlations with a weaker La Niña to that textbook wet north, dry south pattern. And that does add a little bit of uncertainty in the forecast for some of the precipitation differences that we would expect in a given La Niña year. I will say if that kind of variable polar jet stream does set up, it does give us the chance of risking getting under some of the blocking conditions like we've seen. And if that's not in a favorable pattern for precipitation, you go a month like November, without nearly as much rainfall as you typically get in a typical month like that. And you can start to pick up some precipitation deficits pretty quickly. So something of a non-answer, right? There are ways this forecast could fail given the uncertainty surrounding La Nina, and I can't sugarcoat that. Another thing I'll add here, you see this kind of drier forecast over the interior. With that variable jet stream, with these low pressure systems diving into the western US, we saw kind of hints of that in this ECMWF forecast here out for the next month of November. You do run the risk of some of these strong high pressure systems diving in afterwards and producing Santa Ana wind events for parts of Southern California, or the Diablo winds that we discuss out there. And October, November, you don't think of as kind of critical fire months in California. We'll be having to watch that, I think, in the late fall, and then as we go transition into spring here. If we are drier in the south, drier in California, and then we have some of these Santa Ana wind events, those could be more magnified given that dryness with an uptick in fire concern. So that's another thing we'll be watching this winter if we have a drier forecast set up for California, which seems to be the case. I'll leave it there. Hope to update you all soon, but wanted to discuss what we're looking at in terms of that seasonal outlook for winter in the West. Thank you for watching, and I'll talk to you all again.